Time now for the must-read opinion pages, and two on Joe Biden. In a Washington Post column, David Ignatius writes that Joe Biden is the best candidate to beat Trump. His piece reads in part, Joe Biden's limitations as a presidential candidate are so obvious that they're almost a litany. He's too old, too white, too male, too touchy-feely, too loquacious, but he has one huge plus. He may be the person who could move President Trump out of the White House. As Democrats assess the dizzying array of 20 candidates, the first question they should ask is whether a nominee could gain a strong majority in the general election and defeat Trump. If the nominating process produces a candidate who appeals to the party's base but can't defeat the incumbent, it will have failed. Progressive activists within the party are generating ideas and energy that could galvanize a country that wants a fairer economy and a cleaner government. But none of these ideas will matter unless a Democrat wins. The damage Trump would do in a second term might not be undone for decades. In thinking about their party's nominee, paradoxically, Democrats must put the country first. And Willie, it's interesting because as you look at Biden's rollout, the first argument is that he can beat Trump. The second argument is going to need to be his message. And I think of the message of Pete Buttigieg, who has talked about the economy and flatly said that nothing is going to be like it was, and that we have to create a new economy and we have to move factories like this one during his rollout speech into the future. And Joe Biden has such a connection with working class Americans. I think it's going to be really important that he makes that case clearly and talks about how to move the economy into the future while connecting with the working man and woman.
I think that'll be the thrust of his message, actually. He just yesterday wanted to lay out the narrative that I can beat Donald Trump and that we can't continue this way. And we know over the next weeks and months he'll fill in those policy blanks. Gene is also writing about Joe Biden in the Washington Post this morning. His piece, Biden may or may not win the nomination, but he knows the stakes. Gene writes, to be silent about Trump is to tiptoe around the elephant in the parlor. The single biggest issue for the health and prosperity of the nation is getting him out of office. Is Biden too moderate for a party that has moved leftward in recent years? I think he should invite a group of the fiery first-term Democratic women in the House to lunch. Instead of trying to hug them, he should listen to what they have to say. If he fails to make a real effort to understand how the party has changed, his first day on the campaign trail may turn out to have been his best day. There's nothing wrong with his calculation of the stakes, however. The Democratic nominee has to be someone who can stand up to Trump and ultimately beat him. Biden says that is what he'll do. Gene, I think he'll probably do what you suggest because he'll have to reach out to the left wing, the new left wing of the Democratic Party.
Yeah, he has to show that he understands how the party is evolving, how the party has changed, and he has to embrace the new. He can't be resistant to that. That said, as I mentioned earlier, I can see him up on that debate stage against Donald Trump. I can see him out on the campaign trail against Donald Trump. And just in strict political terms, there are a couple of really important groups that Biden, starts with a head start on appealing to. One is those white working class voters in the Rust Belt, the voters who voted for many of them for Obama. Some of them voted for Bernie Sanders in the primary last time, and then they ended up voting for Donald Trump. Joe Biden speaks to those voters. So he starts in a good place there, and he also has a history with African American voters that others in the race are just starting to develop. He has this sort of long career. People know him, so you can imagine in a primary state like South Carolina, for example, Joe Biden could do quite well, and you have to have African American voters come out in large numbers if you're going to win a nomination, if you're going to become president.
I agree with both Gene Gray's column and also David's column. And obviously the game is BT, beat Trump. Having said that, we've got to be careful if it's just the moral argument. If you go back to 2016, we elected a candidate that talked about a Muslim ban, that talked about raping Mexicans as rapists, that went after John McCain, that went after a Gold Star family that was grabbing women. We saw bad guy right there and got elected. 18. The focus was on health care and a rigged system. So he's got to, and Mika, you just touched on this, he's got to very quickly jump to, yes, being the anti-Trump, and yes, we need to find a moral compass, and we need our moral compass in health care that's fair, in a legal system that's not rigged, in wages that start at $15 and $20. So turn that message. If it's just me versus Trump, good versus bad, I get worried when I look back at 16, although obviously he's not Hillary Clinton.
No, but I do think that there's got to be a very clear message as how he brings the economy into the future. We're going to be bringing in the co-founder of Axios, Mike Allen, right now. Mike, this morning, Axios is looking at what your site is calling the Biden disconnect. What is that disconnect?
Hell, Mika, the disconnect is that if you talk to any Democrat within a few miles of where I'm sitting right now, they're going to give you that David Ignatius litany. They're going to talk about Joe Biden as a man out of time. And yet, if you look at the coverage around the country and around the world, you look at the polls that we've been seeing here on Morning Joe, he's the front runner. So I talked to a Biden advisor who said they like being the underdog, and because of this disconnect, they feel like they actually are the underdog because so many of the pundits, so many of the longtime Democrats give him so little chance. So this is going to be the Biden subtext. He'll never say this out loud, but the message that we were getting yesterday was this is no time for rookies. And we saw that in that video that we saw for the first time on Morning Joe. Very presidential, looking to the camera, old-fashioned. He's saying, I don't need to give you the bio shots like those new folks do.
Hey, Mike, it's Heilman here. I'm curious. We've had Mike Barnicle on this show the last couple of days saying that he thinks that, and as you know, he is very fond of the Vice President Biden, that is. And he said he thinks that we're going to be clear relatively quickly whether or not this is going to work or not, whether or not Biden is going to kind of fall apart relatively quickly, or he's going to maintain his status as kind of a presumptive frontrunner or one of the two frontrunners. A, I want to know whether you agree with that, and B, what do you think the metrics are that the press is going to use to judge Biden in the first couple of weeks that he's now a candidate?
Well, I think if you look at those from yesterday, the Biden camp was encouraged. He was not pounced on by the left, which, of course, is what they're concerned about. And I think it's not going to be whether he falls apart. It's going to be how much of the energy, how much of the criticism of the field is trained on him. And, John, as you know, the vice president is very prepared for the other people in the field to go after him. He knows that they see him as the big dog, and what he says behind the scenes is, I've been hurt a lot in my life. These people can't hurt me, so he's going in looking for that fight.
So, Mike Allen, thank you very much.
Have a good weekend.
Appreciate having you on this Friday. Susan Del Percio, why do you think, so Obama endorsed Hillary in June of 2016. Why wouldn't President Obama endorse Joe Biden?
Well, I don't think it's because of the reason that the vice president gave that he didn't ask for his endorsement, which would be very odd. But there is a large field, and I'm sure that in time we'll see how things kind of fall out. But there is time for an endorsement, and this is because of the change in the Democratic primary and their convention rules. It's going to be a tough slug because a lot of people are going to be going to the convention with a lot of delegates. So it is going to be a hard fight. And I think that if the president, former President Barack Obama can stay out of it just a little bit, it won't necessarily hurt Biden unless there is a big time to decide and say we need to now put who the next person is. So I think that's critical. And just one other thing on Biden, I think a lot of people have also been talking about how he stays front runner and works against the primary. In the primary, I think it's also those poll numbers are important to look at. But the other number that will probably be central to his campaign is the one that shows that he is able to beat President Trump. If those numbers still remain high, much higher than any other Democratic candidate, and the Democrats are putting the #1 priority as beating President Trump, that will keep him in the race and keep him alive and well.
Yeah. Just interesting because the decision hadn't been made as to who was the nominee when Obama went behind Clinton.
Right.
So it's just, think he should. Okay. Susan Del Percio, thank you very much. Gene, thank you as well. Still ahead. As Biden was jumping in, Bernie was doubling down. We'll talk about the senator's proposal to give all prisoners voting rights. That conversation is just ahead on Morning Joe.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.